previously in 2006 and 2007 elections. And in terms of comparison with support for these political parties in other regions of Ukraine, in the center of Ukraine, there was also significant increase in support for this type of political parties in 2014. And the similar trend was also evident in Crimea, sorry, not in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, specifically in 2014. But there is a major catch in terms of, again, many political parties like the president, basically they became supportive of such ideas, and this might be just temporary, or this might be based on not ideology but political opportunities, but this actually reflects popular preferences, and such preferences show such a significant support and increase in such political support. But there was also significant differences in terms of priorities in eastern Ukraine still, and in southern Ukraine, without Crimea, such political parties still received after the Orange Revolution, but they also remain after the Euromaidan. Even so, there was significant decrease in popular support for political parties of this orientation, specifically after 2014 Euromaidan, which led again to changes of the government. But it's necessary actually to caution this in terms of reliability or validity of this data, because actually there is another change which took place after the 2014 change of the government, which actually was also manifested in elections in October of this year. Actually, significant decline in terms of voter turnout in these regions in eastern and southern Ukraine. So this is another way actually for people to basically to show that they were kind of not supporting or not voting in terms of elections. And actually, there is evidence actually which suggests that actually they were more pro-Russian, or they were supported for party of regions or separatist supporters. In terms of, again, analysis, I did also statistical analysis. So this is just, again, briefly to illustrate the importance of kind of such approach. Again, this is statistical technique which is useful in order to determine whether actually regional divisions can be explained, for example, by ethnicity, by cultural differences, by religion in Ukraine, by economic development of different regions. And if you compare all these factors using statistical analysis or regression analysis, it's possible actually to see that there are significant differences in terms of support for nationalist pro-Western political parties in Ukraine in all elections. And this was the case in 2016. And very important actually to see that if we keep all other factors constant, still regional differences remain. And in 2006, 2007, this involved differences between Western Ukraine, which was omitted in this case for statistical reasons, and all other regions of Ukraine, which had a smaller support for such political parties. And if you look in 2014 elections, the similar significant differences remain between central Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, and southern Ukraine, when we keep all other factors constant. So support for such political parties in Ukraine, in these regions, much smaller compared to western Ukraine. And if you look into support for another major type of political parties in Ukraine, Russian pro-communist parties in all parliamentary elections held since 2006, we see a very similar pattern. So in this case, in 2006, when we keep all other factors constant, like ethnicity, economic development level, religion, Catholic religion, for example, we see that still regional factors are very significant determinants of popular support for such type of political parties. And this was the case in 2006. For example, in eastern Ukraine, 2006, average region in eastern Ukraine had about 46% higher support in terms of Russian pro-communist political parties compared to western Ukraine. And if you look into elections, again, 2007 elections produced very similar pattern. In 2012 elections were a similar pattern, even so there was a slight decline in support for these political parties. In the same case in 2014 elections. So in 2014 elections we have smaller differences because of lower support for such type of political parties, but still differences are significant, with the exception of center of Ukraine, which shows more significant differences with western Ukraine in 2014. And I did similar analysis for supporting political presidential candidates, and similar patterns exist in terms of support for such type of politicians in Ukraine. And so I just present you again a summary of such analysis using statistical approach. And if you look into such analysis supporting major nationalist pro-Western candidates in all regions of Ukraine, and over major elections since 2004. In the first round, we see again that the regional factors are very significant. They are much more significant compared to most other factors like ethnicity, economic level of development, and religion. And such factors, such divisions remain even in 2014 elections, presidential elections. Even so, they declined, for example, in the case of Eastern Ukraine, in 2014 elections there was more significant differences between Western Ukraine, and also the same case applied to Southern Ukraine without Crimea in 2014, and Central Ukraine compared to Western Ukraine. So there was also significant changes in this regard, but differences remain also between regions. I also conducted a public opinion survey, which was which I commissioned to conduct in Ukraine, to be conducted in Ukraine by the Kyiv International Sociology Institute. And actually, this survey was conducted in the end of April, beginning of May, in order to determine support for separatism in different regions of Ukraine. And I used different measures of separatism, supporting, for example, a secession of Ukraine, from Ukraine supporting independent state for their region, and supporting federal Ukraine with significant regional autonomy, which are basically different types of separatism, and they include specifically support for secessionists for Ukraine. And if you look into the results of this public opinion survey, actually it's possible to see that the majority of regions there was more significant support for separatists, specifically in Western Ukraine, in Volhynia, Transnistria, Bukovina, Galicia, and Central Ukraine. There was very significant, very small support for such separatists, different kinds of separatists. But in contrast, in Donbass, we see that 26% of residents of Donbass supported, 23% of residents of Donbass supported secession from Ukraine. 8% supported and joining another state, in this case Russia. 8% supported secession from Ukraine and formation of independent state, and 23% supported autonomy as a part of federal Ukraine. There was also significant support in other eastern regions of Ukraine, in the center, in the south of Ukraine, but much smaller compared to Donbass. And if you do a statistical analysis to see whether other factors were more significant, we see that still Donbass specifically had much higher support for separatism when we keep all other factors constant. And in this case, we see that also ethnic Russians were much more likely to support separatists in Ukraine, other ethnic minorities as well, compared to ethnic Ukrainians. Russian speakers did not have a higher support compared to Ukrainian speakers, so there was no difference over language. But there were also differences over age. Actually, younger people were more likely to support separatists. And among political parties, the Communist Party was the one whose supporters were more likely to support separatists compared to other political parties. And in case of major religions, Orthodox Christians of Moscow Patriarchate were more likely to support separatists compared to other, religious denominations. And if you look into, changes in terms of political orientation concerning foreign policy issues in Ukraine, so there were major issues in terms of relations between the European Union, NATO, and relations with Russia. So you compare public opinion polls using Razumkov Center data to make them comparable since 2002, and to see actually changes in such support, for example, in cases of joining European Union for Ukraine. And if you look into such changes, actually, before the Orange Revolution, there was much smaller differences actually compared to widening of such differences since the Orange Revolution on this issue, and such differences remain very significant before the Euromaidan, and they still remain significant actually, and they increased slightly after February events actually, which which led to the downfall of the Yanukovych government. And there are new public opinion polls which use different classification of regions conducted by different companies. There are newer ones, but they actually basically produce similar pattern of differences. There are still significant differences on this issue. Even so, the differences decline somewhat, but still differences remain on the issue of European Union membership. Even so, actually, according to my own research on another issue, actually there is no possibility, real possibility for Ukraine to become a member of the European Union. And if you look into another issue, again, in terms of popular support for NATO membership in Ukraine, look into different regions, we see again a similar change. Actually, before the Orange Revolution, there was more consensus on this issue, less significant differences. And in eastern Ukraine, southern Ukraine, about 42% of residents supported such membership in NATO. And this is again very important because at that time, actually, the Yanukovych Party of Regions supported Kuchma's policy actually for Ukraine to join NATO. And this is my big explanation for this. But during the elections in 2004, they used actually NATO as one kind of factor to increase their popular support, and this became a major political issue and led to significant decline in popular support in these regions, in the center and in the south of Ukraine, compared to Western Ukraine and compared to also to the center of Ukraine. So if you look into such support after the Orange Revolution, such divisions increased, and also after the Euromaidan, immediately after the Euromaidan in April of 2014, actually there was much significant increase in popular support for joining NATO in Western Ukraine to 86%, in the central Ukraine to 63%, but still in Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine it still remained at 21 and 18%. And in the case of Southern Ukraine, Crimea is not included, so this is actually would indicate that much more significant changes are actually kind of much lower support in Southern Ukraine was likely if we would include Crimea, which again had much higher support for separatist and pro-Russian orientation, according to various data, before actually it was annexed by Russia. And if you look into issue of support for relations with Russia, preferred type of relations with Russia in Ukraine, in different regions, we see again significant regional differences after the Orange Revolution. And this actually public opinion poll was conducted after the war between Russia and Georgia over the issue of separatist region of South Ossetia. So actually at that time there was very significant support for unification into one state in Eastern Ukraine. 47% of residents of Eastern Ukraine supported such unification, 33% in Southern Ukraine, but only 5% in Western Ukraine supported such unification with Russia. If you look into the similar survey conducted after the Euromaidan, we see actually significant differences remaining on this issue, but still there was also a significant decline in terms of support even in Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine in terms of joining Russia. And in Southern Ukraine, again, Crimea is not included, so this would actually indicate slightly higher support. But we also see that there was also changes in central, in Eastern Ukraine, and most actually people supported basically independent friendly countries without customs and without visas. And now we have a conflict actually involving Russia, so it's very unlikely that such kind of a policy also would take place, that Ukraine would join European Union, or customs union with Russia, or that actually there's even possibility of a direct war between Ukraine and Russia over the issue of separatism in Donbass, and this is still because of direct Russian presence in Donbass since August, and also support for separatists before that time. So in terms of conclusions, it's possible to say, based on this extensive evidence, that again such data shows that there was no radical changes in terms of regional divisions in Ukraine since after the Orange Revolution, but there were significant changes on many of the issues after the Maidan, specifically in terms of elections, and there were significant changes, but still regional divisions remained in Ukraine in terms of support for major political parties, major presidential candidates, and there was also a significant rise in terms of popular support in Donbass and in Crimea for separatists, specifically joining Russia or supporting independent state or federalization and regional autonomy, so different forms of separatism, as they are defined in various academic studies. And finally, if you look into support for foreign policy orientation, preferred relations, we still see significant differences on this issue. Specifically, these differences actually increased after the Orange Revolution on the issue of NATO and European Union membership, and they still remain significant in case after the Euromaidan, even though they declined in recent months. And in terms of relations with Russia, we see, again, less polarization in different regions of Ukraine on this issue, but this actually excludes Crimea, which became part of Russia, most pro-Russian region, and also Donbass, in which, again, pro-Russian separatists now have de facto power. And in terms of this issue, still regional differences remain even after the Euromaidan. Thank you.